All right. I am going to show you how to do three different kinds of t-tests on SPSS. But before I show you how to do it, I need to give you a little bit of a history lesson in the history of hip hop or rap, and specifically the East Coast West Coast battle. So you probably heard that in the 90s, in particular, there was a big battle between East Coast and West Coast rap. And the way that it developed was this. First, rap sort of started in the 70s and early 80s in New York City, and was mostly kind of like a party genre. You know, people, it was for fun, and was not a lot of heavy themes in it. And then in the early 80s, some artists came out and put more of a political spin on a lot of rap. There was still a lot of party rap, but there was also like Public Enemy was talking about politics, and KRS-One was talking about politics, and Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five came out with a very popular rap called The Message, and that was pretty political. So things in the 80s got kind of political, and then in the 90s, there was the emergence of West Coast rap. And West Coast rap started off having a pretty sort of gritty, like this is what it's like on the streets kind of gangster rap sort of start. And it started with Ice-T came out with an album, and then a couple of years later, NWA came out with their album, which was a groundbreaking album. And it started this sort of divergence between East Coast rappers and West Coast rappers. And it really came to a head when NWA's label, or more specifically Dr. Dre's label, signed Tupac. And Tupac became kind of the face of West Coast rap, and went on an award show and talked a fair amount of smack about East Coast rap. And so that was kind of the West Coast side. And then the East Coast side was represented by Biggie. And Biggie was, his producer was P. Diddy now. He used to be Puff Daddy. And so it became this battle between these two labels and these two rappers. It ended up with Biggie getting shot and killed first, and then Tupac was shot and killed. And so it got pretty heavy and ugly. But in any case, in the 90s, there was a pretty big divide between people who were fans of West Coast rap and fans of East Coast rap. And so I've created a data set, and it's got 20 randomly selected hip hop fans who live in the East Coast, let's say in the 90s, and 20 randomly selected West Coast hip hop fans who live on the West Coast. And I asked them, let me show you the variables. I asked them, first I had them listen to a selection of music from East Coast rappers, and I had them rate on a scale from 1 to 10 their enjoyment of the music that they listened to. And then I had them listen to a selection of music from West Coast rappers, and I had them rate their enjoyment of that music on a scale from 1 to 10. So everybody in both groups listened to the same selections of music and rated the East Coast music rap and the West Coast rap on a scale from 1 to 10. So those are my three variables. This here is my categorical East or West variable. I coded the East Coast people as 0 and the West Coast people as 1. So that's just giving numbers to these labels. And then I've got two interval ratio variables. This is ratings of enjoyment of East Coast artists on a scale from 1 to 10. And then the second one is enjoyment of rap by West Coast artists on a scale from 1 to 10. So those are my variables. Now, let's do three different t-tests. So to start with, all of these t-tests are under compare means. So you go to compare means, under analyze, compare means, one sample t-test. And for a one sample t-test, you take either of these variables, and down here where it says test value, this is where you say what is the population mean? So remember, a one sample t-test is going to compare the sample mean to the population mean. So we've got the sample data here. What do we suppose the population mean is? So enjoyment of East Coast rap, let's suppose that the population mean is 6 on a scale from 1 to 10. I'm just making that up. Maybe you have information about what the population mean is and you can put it in there. Maybe you're hypothesizing what the population mean is, but in any case, this is how you would do it. You would put the population mean or your guess about the population mean there. We look at options and we're going to get a confidence interval for the mean. The default is 95% confidence interval. You can change that to a 99%, whatever you want. I'm going to leave the default. And let's click OK, and it'll run the analysis for us. We had 20 cases in each group, so that's a total of 40 cases. And the sample mean was 5.95. That's the sample standard deviation. That's the standard error of the mean. So the difference that we would expect to get between the sample mean and the population mean, just due to chance, is 0.38 points. In other words, if we were to select random samples of size 40 from this population, the average difference between those sample means and the population mean would be 0.38 points. All right, down here we see the results of the t-test. The t-value, this is our observed t-value, the one that's calculated, is negative 0.131. That's a very small t-value. Degrees of freedom is 39 because there's 40 cases, and in a one sample t-test, the degrees of freedom is the number of cases minus 1. Significance, this is the p-value of 0.896. For our result to be statistically significant, that p-value would need to be below 0.05, and it's not. So our result is not statistically significant. There's no difference between our sample mean and our population mean, or no significant difference. And any difference that we do see between the sample mean and the population mean is too likely to be due to chance for us to rule chance out. And then here's the confidence interval for the difference between the means. So that's not the confidence interval for the population mean. That's the confidence interval for the difference between the means. So this is saying we're 95% confident that the actual difference between the population mean and this sample mean is between those two values. So that's not all that useful to know in a one sample t-test, but that's how you do it. Now, let's do an independent samples t-test. And normally, you'd have all three variables over here in your variable list. The grouping variable is this whether people live on the East Coast or the West Coast. So you highlight it and you put it over here, and then it says define groups. See, there's question marks there. We got to define the groups. So one group, the East Coast people, are a value of 0, and the West Coast people are a value of 1. Put that in there. And let us compare these two groups on the enjoyment of rap by the East Coast artists. So take a look at our options, same options. Click OK. Okay, so now we're comparing two different groups, each with a sample size of 20. The enjoyment of rap by East Coast artists has a mean of 7.45 for people who live on the East Coast and a mean of 4.45 for people who live on the West Coast. That looks like a pretty big difference. Like people on the East Coast like East Coast rap more than people on the West Coast do. When you're reading the results in SPSS from a t-test, the first thing you look at is this, the F value, and whether that's significant. That F value of 0 is not significant at all. And what it's testing is whether the variances of the two groups are equal. So if you look at the standard deviations here, you can see they're pretty close. And the standard errors of the mean are close. So there's not a significant difference in the variances. If there if the variances are not different from each other, meaning if they're equal, you read this top line. If they're different from each other, you read the bottom line. Here they're equal, because that's not significant. We read the top line. That observed t-value is 5.017. 38 degrees of freedom, because we have 20 in each sample, and you subtract 1 from each sample. 20 plus 20 minus 2, or 19 plus 19, both ways equal 38. This is the p-value for the t-test. You can see it's very significant. That number is below 0.05. That is the difference between the means, standard error of the difference between the means, and the confidence interval of the difference between the means. So this is what this is saying. We are 95% confident that the difference between the population means of East Coast and West Coast dwellers in their enjoyment of East Coast rap ranges from East Coast rappers enjoying East Coast dwellers enjoying East Coast rap between 1.789 and 4.210 points more than people who live on the West Coast. That's how you interpret that. I'm going to go back up to analyze and just show you something. Compare means, independent samples, t-test. We could put our other variable in there, and we could run 2 t-tests at the same time. If you don't want to do them one at a time, you just put both of your variables in there, and it'll run 2 separate t-tests. So here's the one that we just saw. Here's the one where it's enjoyment of West Coast rap, and you can see the results are kind of flipped. People who live on the West Coast enjoy West Coast rap more than people who live on the East Coast. Both of these variances tests are not significant, so we're going to look at the top line of both. We just looked at this one and found it was statistically significant. Now we're looking at this one, and we find that that's statistically significant as well. You might notice this t-value is negative. That's because in both of these examples, we took the value of the East Coast rappers first and subtracted the value of the West Coast people. So here, when we go 4.25 minus 7.35, that's going to produce a negative number, a difference of negative 3.1. That's why it's negative there. Okay, and the last one, we are going to do a paired t-test. Now, set this up. Okay, so here's our list of variables. A paired t-test, we're not comparing groups to each other. We're comparing the same group in terms of on 2 different variables. So suppose that my question is, I wonder overall whether people like East Coast rap or West Coast rap more. Like if you put all 40 people together, do they rate East Coast rap as being better or West Coast rap as being better? So here we're going to put enjoyment of East Coast rap. Let me see if I can stretch this out so we can see these. Yeah. And then I click on enjoyment of West Coast rap and I put that over there. Options, same options. And click OK. Here's what we get. There's 40 cases because the cases are now being combined. Here's the mean for overall enjoyment of rap by East Coast artists. Here's the mean of overall enjoyment for rap by West Coast artists. You can see that there's a negative correlation between these two. Generally speaking, the more people like East Coast rap, the less they like West Coast rap, and vice versa. The difference in the means here is not very large, so it's probably not going to be statistically significant. This number right here, the mean, that's actually the difference between the 2 means of 0.15. Here is the t-value. Here's the degrees of freedom. Now all of the cases have been put together. So now it's 40 minus 1 is the degrees of freedom. And here's the significance. That's much larger than 0.05. So our results are not statistically significant. So we would say in the population, there's no difference between the average enjoyment of rap by East Coast artists and rap by West Coast artists. They're equal. The population means for those 2 variables are equal. So one group compared twice, they groups, that one group overall does not differ in their enjoyment of East Coast and West Coast. Now we know East Coasters like East Coast rap better and West Coasters like West Coast rap better, but those differences balance out when you put the two groups together, and you end up with no significant differences when you combine them all.